I want to review a few of the concepts that you are reading in Chapter 5. Just hopefully with the text it will maybe make a little more sense to you. So I'm going to start off. What they're talking about in Chapter 5 is, so we've described classical conditioning, basic US, UR, CS, CR. Now the question is, so what actually is happening? Where is the real learning taking place? And there's essentially two possible answers to this. One is that the key connection that's being associated or learned is something between the CS and the US. That these two things are going together. Okay, so you have a bell and it's being connected to food, and that's causing some kind of response. So this would be a kind of SS learning, stimulus learning. The other is that maybe they focus on the fact that this conditioned stimulus comes to elicit a response. So maybe something about a stimulus response connection is the real key component. Now, as your book will say, there's a little bit of evidence on both sides, but we want to look at a couple of things regarding this issue of where does the learning take place. The first one we want to look at is Pavlov's stimulus substitution model. This is a kind of SS theory, stimulus learning theory. So I have my kind of weird alien head looking guy here. What he says is basically that conditioned stimulus in being active, that neural center, that whatever part of your brain is active when, say, a bell is rung, because it's active at the same time then that the food is presented and the food area of your brain is active, that a connection between these two becomes strengthened. So it would be as if we have, a little CS center in our brain that's having lots of action potentials while the conditioned stimulus is being presented. And then we also have a US center in our brain that is activated by the US happening, which may be food put in your mouth. And that because these things are active at the same time, they become connected, like an actual neural pathway gets created and strengthened, such that, the US always, of course, creates a response, but with enough experience, he thinks because this pathway was strengthened, the conditioned stimulus will then basically activate that US brain center, which will then activate the response. Now, if it was this simple, if Pavlov was correct, we would always expect the conditioned response and the unconditioned response to look very similar. Now, in Pavlov's setup, he was, measuring salivation, and the dogs were salivating to the conditioned stimuli as well as the unconditioned stimuli, the bell and the food. But that's not always the case. Think of the rat where the tone or the light is predicting a shock, the conditioned emotional response setup. And that, the CR and the UR are completely different. In the UR, the response to shock is the rat jumps. There was a video of that. In the conditioned response, however, he doesn't jump, he like freezes. So that's kind of the biggest thing that she says, well, it can't just be this simple. So we'll just, sorry, Pavlov, cross that one out. Now, the fact that you can have the CRs can be very different behavior than the UR, that is actually pretty good support for the preparatory response model. And that's the idea that the conditioned response is going to be something that prepares you for that US. So if I have something that tells me food's on the way, I'm going to get ready and start salivating. That makes sense. Now, always know that when the CR is similar to the UR, like when it's salivation and salivation, the conditioned response is always going to be at least less intense. You don't salivate quite as much to the thought of food or cues that food's coming as you do when food's actually in your mouth. It's probably hard to recognize that because when food's in our mouths, we don't feel it the same as when we're standing in the potato chip aisle salivating, which actually that's a pretty intense response for me, but generally CRs are always going to be less intense than URs, but they do often prepare us. Think of the rat who's freezing right now. He's, preparing like for the possibility there could be pain coming, and your book has a great sort of explanation about that from a biological point of view. When would a rat feel pain, and what should he do when there's a cue for a predator? So go read that part. Okay. Your book then also gets into compensatory response model. Now, this is a particular kind of preparatory response. And they don't use the same terms as we did when we talked about heroin overdose, but map that on yourself. when they're talking about that whole model of drug tolerance, heroin overdoses, that sort of thing, that is what we were talking about with the opponent process model. So the compensatory response could be the B process, right? The drug, the initial response to the drug would be the A process. And then your body compensates the conditioned response to a cue that tells you a drug's coming. The conditioned response would be to compensate for what's about to happen, so to counteract it. And that does explain why people can often tolerate higher and higher doses of drug. I didn't tell you one of my other stories, did I, for the opponent process, and it fits in the compensatory response. It's really, the opponent process and compensatory response are very, all saying the same thing. Those two things are the same thing. I was skydiving once, and there were these skydivers on the plane, and they were in their little suits, and they were practicing doing, like, they jump out and they'll do little formations, and, you know, this is what teams do. So anyway, we're in the little plane, and we're getting up, and we get to the point where you're going to get out of the plane. And all these skydivers who do this over and over, do this a ton, right? And they're going up over and over all day. They start pulling out and chugging Red Bull. Red Bull. Like, you know, I'm on this little plane, my heart's like, I'm about to jump on a plane. This is like really freaky. What are we thinking? What were they doing? Why did they need Red Bull? It's a stimulant. It's going to get you a little more hyped. And why weren't these guys already hyped? Because they skydive all the time. So to them, their bodies are prepared for the challenge. They probably had a compensatory response, or what we could say the B process. And they were ready. And so they're up there like, you know, this is kind of boring. I skydive all the time. It's not very exciting, right? So I need something to jazz me up. I need Red Bull to make this awesome. Kind of weird, but it fits perfectly with the kind of thing we're talking about here. You also see the alcohol example in that chapter 5. Let me just check my notes. Okay, so now in chapter 5, notice that we are not doing the section on Rescorla-Wagner theory. I saved that piece of the content for anyone who wants to go on and take Psychology 420, which is about theories of learning, which means if you love this class and you want to dive even deeper, you could take theories of learning and you'll do Rescorla-Wagner there. So you can skip that part in our chapter. But there is some more after that, I believe. Of course, the stuff on, let's see, what else do I want to? Oh, all the phobia stuff. Okay, read it. It's well written. I don't really need to say much about it except one thing. When you're, the idea of systematic desensitization, that technique that Volpe came up with, please recognize that the anxiety hierarchy that he uses is simply imagined stimuli. So you have this, build this idea, like if I'm afraid of, you know, spiders, and you come up with these sort of baby steps, gradual steps, where you imagine there's a spider in an aquarium with the top nicely sealed, it's safe, you can't get out, it's across the room. And that would make me a little nervous if I'm afraid of spiders. So that's like my first level. Now imagine the top of the aquarium is off, but it's still over there and he's in his aquarium. So what you're doing is you build these sort of more and more fearful things that you can just think about and imagine. And you practice being relaxed while you're imagining these things. That's completely different from in vivo stimuli, where you're going to expose somebody to their feared thing in real life. Okay. I know there's these videos like from Jerry Springer about people being, put in a room with a clown when they're deathly afraid of clowns, or have them chasing them around the studio with pickles and they're afraid of pickles. That's really, I don't like to share those sorts of videos with phobias, because if these people are really phobic, which they may be, it's horribly dangerous and harmful to those people to be trying to expose them in that way. And it's only going to make their phobia worse and not going to really help them, probably. I don't know, you can see videos that cross the line and videos that don't out there. But I want to remind you, if you do see those sorts of things as a psychology major, I hope you, instead of laughing at the Jerry Springer people with their phobias, I hope you would appreciate that people actually do suffer from, yes, a little bit strange phobias sometimes, but it doesn't mean they're not suffering. And there are good ways to go about treating it and really horrible and voyeuristic ways to exploit it. So please be sensitive to that, because I know there's stuff out there that's might seem like entertainment, but sometimes it's actually humans who are suffering and not, having panic attacks. So let's be careful about that. But there's plenty of stuff in the phobia section I want you to read. But again, I'm not going to say much about it here because the textbook covers it very well. So I'll let you go ahead and read that and practice things in the Chapter 5 quiz.